siswa asing muni. Kalau ini mau masuk, bagaimana cara aku mengajar? Iya.
international.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Why is it not started yet?
So the session will begin at 1 p.m. sharp, and it's just 12:53. So yeah, we'll begin just soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Waalaikumsalam.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening,
Good afternoon.
good afternoon, Bu Lina.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for attending the first session, Bu Lina.
Yeah.
Is Ibu Fina here? Bu Fina, I think Bu Fina is already here.
Yes, I'm here, Pak Ubat. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Fina. We are worried because we heard that yesterday you went to the hospital, so we are worried that you wouldn't make it today, but Alhamdulillah.
Yes, it's regular checkup. Thank you.
I think it's 1 p.m. now, and Paubat is a moderator. I think, Paubat, are you?
Yes, but
Now,
I think,
I think yes.
Alfat is going to open the session first, and then she will give it to me to chair the session.
Okay, I'm the host, Zoom host today. So my job is admitting the people to the group.
Okay.
So now I leave Paubat. Paubat is yours now.
Okay. Alfat, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alfat Eka, and I feel truly honored to be your master of ceremony for today, Wednesday, 19th of August, 2020. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you on the second day of our summer program 2020 with the theme of Indigenous Communities of Indonesia, Gender, Education, and Nationalism, held by Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to have a session regarding the theme of decolonizing gender discourses in Indonesia, negotiating local and global values. Sorry. But before we begin, I would also like to invite Mr. Tep Ubat Abdullah MPD as our moderator for today's session. So, to Mr. Abdullah, time is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alfat. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from Bandung, Indonesia, to you all in whichever side of the world you are right now. Well, first of all, allow me to reintroduce myself. You can call me Ubad, it's UBAD, but please don't try to split it into two parts because it's going to be pronounced Ubad. I mean, don't call me that. So starting from today, I'm going to be chairing most of the sessions. And most of the day, some of the days I will be your interpreter, and most of the days I will be the moderator for your session. And today's talk, as you may have heard from Alfat, is going to be decolonizing gender discourses in Indonesia, negotiating indigenous and global values. The speaker is already here. Thank you so much, Ibu Fina, for willing to share with us your valuable experiences and insights. But before I invite her to speak to you all, allow me to start with a local greeting. So whenever I say Sampurasun, you have to respond to me by saying Rampes. Everybody, please unmute your audio and then let's try it, okay? Because it's all about indigenous things, right? So let's start with some indigenous greetings. Whenever I say Sampurasun, you have to respond to me by answering Rampes. Let's try it. Sampurasun.
Rampes.
Right.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's like a local greeting, like probably like how do you do and how do you do. Before, allow me to briefly read Ibu Fina's curriculum vitae before I invite her to talk. Fina Adriani, PhD, is the head of Department of Early Childhood Education, School of Postgraduate Studies, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. And she earned her Bachelor of Human Science Psychology at the Department of Psychology International Islamic University, Malaysia in 2000. and she pursued her Master of Education in Educational Psychology at the Faculty of Education, International Islamic University, Malaysia. And she earned her PhD with the thesis entitled Gendered Power Relations Within Child-Centered Discourse, an ethnographic study in a kindergarten in Bandung, Indonesia, at the Department of Educational Research, Lancaster University, UK in 2013. She has been publishing enormous works, either in journal articles, conference proceedings, books, in internationally reputable publishers, which I cannot read them one by one due to the huge number of them. And she has also been a keynote speaker in a variety of conferences, some of which are Beyond an Economic Model of ECEC in Malaysia, Malaya University in 2019, and Children's Construction of Femininities in Ankara University, Turkey. And she is also an editorial member of some journals, one of which is The Colonization of Early Childhood Education. Well, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in giving the most warmest welcome to Ibu Vina Adriani.
Thank you very much, Pak Ubad, for a very generous introduction. So, a very good afternoon to all the participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much to Pak Abu also for the invite. And it's such an honor for me to be able to meet all of you, even though nowadays we need to change our mode of communication from an offline face-to-face meeting into an online meeting. But I hope it doesn't take away the meaning of this summer school program. So I'm very excited and also very honored to discuss with you about the topic of decolonizing gender discourse in Indonesia. As Pak Ubad has kindly mentioned just now, I'm actually based in the Department of Early Childhood Education, but my research was focused on the topic of gender and power in the early years. And for the past couple of years, I've been drawing from the post-colonial approaches. So I thought this might be something that we would like to unpack further in our discussion. So
Ibu Vina, my apologies for interrupting, but would you be so kind to turn up the volume, please?
Okay, sure. Now, is it okay? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's clear, clear enough. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ubad. So I've read some of the background of the participants, and I'm pleased to learn, and also kind of nervous a little bit because many of you actually already have knowledge about Indonesia. So what I will be doing today is most like sharing my perspective, and obviously you are more than welcome to share your perspective as well. The topic that I'm going to discuss with you today is sort of like a foundation for the next 2 weeks that you will be joining in this program. So hopefully we'll have some fruitful discussion afterward. So allow me to share the PowerPoint. So disclaimer, so my daughter make this PowerPoint for me. I mean, I'm making this PowerPoint, but she's sort of like editing, so a lot of picture involved here in this PowerPoint because she thought my PowerPoint is a little bit old style, so she's thinking to make it more up to date using this new software called Canva. Yeah, so I will be talking about decolonizing gender discourses in Indonesia, negotiating local and global values. So basically in this presentation, I would like to invite you to engage in a discussion whether or not gender discourse is actually derived from the Western concept, whether it is derived from the Western norm. And very often when people talk about gender discourses, they see these discourses are incompatible with the values of Indonesia. For example, for the past couple of years, we've seen this kind of movement. I don't think there are many, to be honest, but they are quite loud, I have to say. So they are very often promoting the idea Indonesia without feminism. So the whole idea of you have to uninstall feminism, that feminism is incompatible with the value of Indonesian society. So sort of like the idea that to some extent see gender equality as a foreign concept. And this is something that I would like to discuss in today's discussion. Is gender equality really a foreign concept? And also there is this whole idea that, gender discourse that emphasize on the fluidity of gender, the flexibility of gender that tries to go beyond the binary. Pak Ubad, could you please help me? Okay. So there is also this understanding. I think there is also this understanding among people who who see feminist movement as a threat for this country. The idea that see gender discourse as something that imported solely from the north. So the whole emphasis on the fluidity of gender, the idea to go beyond the binary between the male and female, for example, is seen as something that is being imported from the north. And that's why, as I saw in this picture, people are resisting to the idea of feminism, people are resisting to the idea of gender equality, people are resisting to the whole notion of gender discourses. And what I would like to discuss in today, we see really the case, is gender equality really a foreign concept? Is gender discourse is really imported from the north? And this is what I'm going to discuss with you today. So I think this is something very basic, and I'm sure with the level of knowledge that you have, you already know that when we talk about gender, we talk about the socially constructed roles of behavior, responsibility. It is also a socially constructed roles on how society expects men and women to behave. And because it is constructed, so the whole idea about gender discourse, that it can also be deconstructed. And this is something that we are going to see. So I would like to talk a little bit. And when we, because this whole summer school program, if I'm not mistaken, is about the colonizing project. If I'm not mistaken, Pa Abdul, yeah, that is how I understand the summer school program. So the whole program, the whole syllabus of the program is trying to invite the participants and also the speakers to be engaged in the whole of decolonizing by presenting some stories, some evidence from the indigenous people. And in order to understand further about this decolonizing project, I think we need to talk about a little bit about some post-colonial realities. When we see some post-colonial realities, as you could see in this picture, we will see that very often we situate European civilization as the center of human history. Whenever we talk about the history of the civilization, the history of epistemology, for example, history of any discipline of knowledge, it is almost inevitable that we always situate European civilization as the center of human history. So European civilization becomes the norm in order to understand human history. And as the result, it creates the binary between the Europe, where Europe becomes the center, and the non-European are seen as a peripheral, are seen as the marginalized. And there is also this binary between the West and the East, or now people talk about the binary between the North and the South. And against the whole binary, some very often situate those non-European civilizations as somehow subordinate. They are seen to be less, if not not civilized. So there is this othering process that taking place. In other words, very often people in the South, people in the East, in the non-European countries, they are seen as the other. They are considered to be different. Very often there is this idea they are seen as savage, as uncivilized, traditional, not modern, and so forth. And this is why I show you this picture, because in the past when Western researchers, for example, they go to the countries in the East or in the South, they're perpetuating this idea that there is this difference between European and non-European, between the West and the East, and between the North and the South. And this post-colonial realities is also affecting, as I said, because this is very evident, this is very obvious in all aspects of knowledge, in almost in all discipline of knowledge. So it's also affecting a kind of feminist movement. So what I would like to talk about is that when we talk about feminist movement, we always talk about feminist movement from the Western history. So, so when we talk the feminist movement from the Western history, then in general, the feminist movement will be divided into three major waves. The first wave, where the whole idea is that woman has the right to vote, for example, and then the second wave feminism, the whole debate is surrounding among the women's rights. That women, they have the right to do whatever they want to. So the notion of equality is also coming in the second wave. And then in the third wave movement, we also recognize some post-colonial movement. And this post-colonial movement is actually derived from the consciousness, from an understanding that, as I mentioned before, the epistemology of the feminist movement has been very much influenced by the European civilization. So by 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 seeing feminist history from the lens of the history from the Western perspective, then we tend to ignore that there is also the similar, if not the similar movement, a feminist movement in another part of the world. So I think there is this idea that women outside the Europe, outside the North, they are seen as somehow passive, they are seen as somehow being exploited. I'm not saying that there is no exploitation in the South. Definitely they are, and we have to recognize that. But the whole idea that creates the feminist movement in the Western is somehow to be the savior for the woman in the South, that I would like to problematize in today's discussion. So I'm going to invite you to this is one of my favorite quote from Spivak. I'm sure many of you know that Spivak is one of the post-colonial theorists. Spivak said that the legacy of colonialization is evident when a white man saving a brown woman from a brown man. And I think this is very, very, very obvious when we talk about, for example, women in Afghanistan. This is a picture from the woman in Afghanistan. We always portray an image that they are somehow helpless, they are somehow passive, they are the victim, they don't have any agency, they are exploited. And again, I'm not saying this to deny the fact that they are being exploited. I think we have to recognize that indeed in their society, patriarchy is very strong, that women are struggling in order to be recognized as a human being, for example. But what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't mean there is no resistance. They are resistant from the women themselves. They are resistant from the local culture themselves. They are resistant from the local people itself. And I think when we want to talk about decolonizing gender discourse, it's important to recognize this kind of resistance, that people in the South, that people in the East, for example, they are not simply passive, become the victim of their own life. They are also resisting, and resistance can take various forms. We have a day-to-day resistance, for example, where people are protesting on a daily basis, where people are trying to navigate, a lot of things. So again, this is not to deny the kind of exploitation or the kind of limitation women have in particular countries. But I think it is also important to recognize that there is also resistance, there is also fighting, there is also challenge done by the women themselves in that particular society. And so again, when we talk about the feminist movement, which is derived from the Western epistemologies, so it's also following the things that I mentioned before, that it to some extent situate other culture as the other. They are seen as different, not only different, but they are also seen as subordinate. So I think this is where the issue comes in. So for example, when in Indonesia last year, there is a huge protest where people is trying to protest one controversial bill. And the bill is actually consisting of so many things. It limits people's freedom. It also, the bill is also potentially exploiting indigenous people, for example, and also the bill also talk about the law that try to regulate the private sex life of a people, for example. But it's very interesting to see that despite of the protest is so dynamic, is so it carries many levels. It's the state control that is being protested by the people. They emphasize display in the Western media, for example, is that Indonesian people are protesting over sex before marriage bill, while actually there are a lot of things that they are being protested. So I think again, this situates the idea as, these people from the East that they sex is seen as something taboo. So, and now they are seen as being, they are seen as having this rising movement in order to protest this thing, but they are missing the larger picture. I think the picture in this particular protest is trying to demonstrate how people are actually resisting to the control of the state, and including in this aspect, for example, but there are also many other aspects that people are protesting. So an idea that, people are actually trying to defend the basic human rights are missing from the discourse in the media, for example. So I would like to invite you to some of the feminist critique of the Western feminist epistemology. Again, when I'm talking about the Western epistemology, it's not that I'm perpetuating further the binary between the East and the West, the North and the South, but I think it is important for us to understand the kind of hegemony the Western ideology has. And if we would like to decolonize their ideology, I think we need to recognize some of the critiques. And I would like to invite to some of the key thinkers in the feminist post-colonialists, for example. I think some of you, I'm sure, are very much familiar with the work from Mohanty, Narayan, and also Spivak, in which they have provided critiques to the epistemological foundation of the Western feminism because of its desire to speak about and speak for non-Western women. So I think non-Western woman is always understood from a Western point of view. And I think again, when we talk, the picture that I show you earlier, it's a picture, an example of an ethnographic, anthropological studies done in the past. But I think very often, if we are not careful, the kind of approach, the kind of research methodology can perpetuate further the binary between the East and the West, where the people in the non-Western context will always be understood from a Western point of view. And also this kind of perspective also perpetuates the binary position between Western women and non-Western women, where non-Western women will be seen, again, as I mentioned, as subordinate, and they are seen as having no agency at all. And therefore, there is a need to save them from both Western men and also Western women. And I think this is why Spivak earlier says about the legacy of colonialization is evident when a white man tries to save a brown woman from a brown man. I think that kind of thinking is very much evident. For example, if we take into account the Americans' aggression toward Afghanistan, toward Iran, it's always putting the woman into the center. The idea to save the Iranian woman, the idea to save the Afghanistan woman, which is, again, I'm not saying that they are not being exploited, but at the same time, I think we also need to believe that there is also a resistance within themselves, and it's important to recognize that that resistance exists. So this kind of thinking, this kind of binary position between Western women and non-Western women, as I argued earlier, is perpetuating the subordination of the non-Western woman. And Mohanty also claims that the feminists in the global North, they tend to homogenize the experience of women in the global South. So again, women in the global South are seen as one single category. They are seen as helpless, as passive. For example, let's take a look in the discussion of the child marriage, for example. I'm not saying that child marriage is not an issue. I myself, I'm very much participating in trying to educate people, not to let their daughter marry in such a young age. But at the same time, the whole idea about child marriage, for example, is always seen as something, as a problem which is only exists in the Eastern countries, in the countries like Indonesia. While at the same time, for example, even in the country like UK, there are also problems. Maybe not child marriage, but they also have something, a problem related to their teenager, for example. So I'm saying that each region, each country, they have their own problem. And I think it is very much problematic to assume that a particular region, they are seen as having more problem than the other region, for example. And this is where Mohanty see that there is a problem in this kind of thinking that tends to homogenize the experience of women in the global South. Because if we go back again to the kind of the feminist movement that I mentioned earlier, I'm not going into detail into the kind of the stage of the history of this movement, but I think it's important, again, as I mentioned, to recognize that this particular movement was derived from the situation, the conflict, the resistance faced by the women in the Western at that time. Okay, so I think Bang Svensson, she's a feminist from Norway, who is very much involved in the whole project of decolonization. She come up with this question. She thinks that, I think this may explain some of the conflict we experience in the classroom. Why do discussion on gender become problematic for diversely racialized students? And I think it's going back again to the first question that I'm asking, why there is a resistance toward feminist movement in Indonesia. Is feminist seen as something to be a foreign concept? why there is a resistance toward the notion of gender equality. Because if we carefully unpack the notion aims to bring justice to male and female, but why there is a resistance? And I think this is why it is important to adopt a post-colonial lens so that we understand where the problem lies. So what is missing from the discourse? And I think, as Bang Spencer suggests, perhaps it has to do with our different basic understanding of gender. I think in one of her publications, she also elaborates how perhaps the notion of gender is something which is derived from the Western language, that perhaps in each society, and especially when we talk about indigenous society, they have actually their own term to discuss about the notion of gender. Because very often when the notion is something familiar to the people in the community, then they feel the engagement, they feel like the concept is something that they can relate to. Something, yeah. So I would like to talk about the decolonialization process, for example. So if we look at the work of Cornell in 2018, Cornell explained decolonization as the process. So basically when Cornell talks about this decolonialization, she's referring to the decolonization of sociology. But I think her idea can easily be applied to every other field of knowledge, including gender studies. So Cornell talked about decolonization as the process of correcting the distortion and exclusion produced by empire and global inequality, and reshaping the discipline in a democratic direction on a world scale. So I think in order to be engaged in the process of decolonization, we need to recognize that there is a global inequality. So going back again to our discussion about the binary between the East and the West, the North and the South, for example, very often the discussion do not take into account global inequality. So for example, when the media, for example, display women in Asia or in Middle East or in Africa as somehow helpless, as somehow the victim, for example, they don't talk about that it is also resulted by capitalism, by global inequality. So it's not merely because the culture themselves, for example, or because um, so it's more than just an exploitation that happens within the society, but there is also some global discourses that shape gender discourses in the country. So we need to recognize the global inequality, and then by recognizing the global inequality, then perhaps we could reshape the discipline in a democratic direction on a world scale. In another word, the main aim of decolonization is that to have a more to have a justice perspective, a social justice lens in understanding gender discourses by bringing the voice of the local people. So when we talk about decolonization, I think in my understanding, there are at least three things involved. The first one, decolonization is involving in the process of undoing of colonialism. In another word, in order to be engaged in the process of decolonization, we need to carefully unpack the history of colonialization. We need to carefully see the root of colonialization. And once we are able to see the root of colonialization in the society, then we can decenter the knowledge. And how can we decenter the knowledge? By re-articulating or by trying to using it's almost like a person who's digging something. If you are familiar with the genealogical approach from Michael Foucault, for example, so it's almost like an archaeologist where they are trying to find when they are trying to understand one archaeological work, for example, they are digging deeper and deeper in order to understand the thing that they would like to cover, for example. So in the decolonization process, I will say that it's also involving a similar but not identical thing, whether there is this re-articulation, reproduction of knowledge and experience of the subaltern people. So by subaltern people, if we look at the word of Spivak, for example, it involves any groups which are affected by colonialization. So it can be the local people, and I think many literature have suggested that when we talk about colonialization, indigenous people, they are affected the most by it. So when we are talking about decolonization, it could also mean that we are trying to re-articulate their experience. We are trying to bring their voice heard. We are trying to make their experience be visible. because what happened is that with the colonialization, the history are being erased. So people are not familiar with their own history. They are more familiar with the history of the colonizer. And take example, for example, Indonesia. Almost all references in Indonesia are always derived from the Western theories. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but at the same time, people are not aware. People do not know about their own history. So this is where the issue is. Yeah. So now when we talk about Indonesia, I think I'm sure that the fact that you are participating in the summer school program, I believe that it means some of you already have knowledge about Indonesia. So Indonesia is a very huge, enormous country. It has more than 250 million population. Some references suggest that we have 270 million population. And the data from, if I'm not mistaken, let me check the data from the IWGIS suggests that there are approximately 50 to 70 million indigenous people in Indonesia. So, and again, we are, if many of us, including me, perhaps, we are not aware of their history. And especially when we would like to talk about gender discourses, we are not aware of the gender discourses available in the indigenous people, for example. So Indonesia is also a very multicultural, multi-ethnic country. I think references, if I'm not mistaken, suggested that we have more than 300 ethnicities. Obviously, Japanese, Sundanese are the most dominant races, the most dominant ethnicities in the country. That's why very often they become the norms, and it also creates a problem, for example. But in general, it is a very multicultural, multi-ethnicities country, and each ethnicity, they speak their own languages, for example. And it's also a very multi-faith, multi-religious country. The state, for example, at the moment recognize 6 official religion: Islam, Christianity, Hindus, Buddhism, and then Confucius, and then the other one. I think they divide Christianity between Protestant and Catholics, if I'm not mistaken. But again, if we would like to talk about the religion of the indigenous people, for example, there are actually many religious practices which are not yet recognized by the state. In West Java, for example, we know that there is this indigenous religion called Sunda Wiwitan, for example, and very often because the state do not recognize the existence of this religion, they also experience some degree of discrimination, for example, when sometimes they have to disguise their belief, they have to pretend either they become a Muslim or they become a Christian in order to for example, to have a letter, a marriage paper, for example, from the state. So you could imagine that with this kind of complexity, Indonesia is a country full of hope in one hand, I have to say, but it's also a country full of paradox, full of contradiction in another hand. Yeah. Now, and I would like to, because this whole presentation is about trying to decolonize the gender discourse in Indonesia, so I would have to briefly discuss the history of gender discourse in Indonesia. And again, I think the whole idea of presenting this history is trying to decenter the knowledge, because very often when we talk about Indonesian movement, for example, going back again to the first picture that opened my presentation, when there is this rising anti-feminist movement in Indonesia, so people tend to forget that actually the country has undergone a very long history of feminist movement. For example, here in this slide, I will be talking about the gender discourses that take place during the post-colonial time, means after independence. And I think it's very interesting to understand that Indonesia, for example, after the Independence Day, they have appointed 2 female ministers, for example. Maria Ulfa Santoso was appointed as the Minister of Social Affairs, and at the same time, S.K. Trimurti was also appointed as the Minister of Labor. And during the independence time, it was characterized by the high improvement in politics. So I think it's very important to bring this picture, because again, the movement or the agenda for gender equality or the agenda for women's involvement in the public space is actually not something new. It's something that women in Indonesia have been fighting from a very, very long time. And to some extent, during the Independence Day, for example, it started to getting recognized. So it's very interesting when nowadays there is this movement that try to domesticate women, try to controlling women, try to put women back into the domestic sphere, for example. I think it's very sort of like detached from the whole history of the country, if you understand what I mean. Because if we look at the history of the country, that actually women's involvement has always been there. And also, if we see in the New Order state, for example, that takes place from the 1965 to 1998 during the dictatorship of the President Suharto President, for example. In this New Order, I have to say this is where the woman involvement in the politics are being limited, are being confined. If you have read the work from Julia Suryakusuma, for example, Julia Suryakusuma introduced the notion of state egoism. So basically, the idea where a state promotes or produce, endorse certain type of gender ideology, and the gender ideology of the state is very much domesticating women. So during the New Order government, for example, because the New Order government, they see the woman involvement in the politics as a threat to the status quo. So when the New Order government took their power from the previous president, the first thing they want to do is try to domesticate women. And they produced, for example, the marriage law, 1974 marriage law. I think that's probably the only law in the countries that specifically says or specifically differentiate the role of a woman, of a wife, and the role of a husband. So in that law, in that marriage law 1974, it clearly says that the role of a husband as a breadwinner of the family and the role of a wife as a manager of the house, for example. So this is what Surya Kusuma mentioned as state egoism. So state egoism refers to the whole idea that the state promotes certain type of gender ideology. But as you could see, the gender ideology promoted by the New Order government is completely detached from the country's history. Because initially, before the New Order government, women has always been participating in the politics, in the public sphere. And I will talk more a little bit about that later. But this is during the New Order government where women are being domesticated and they are using the state in order to do that. I mean, I respect women who choose to become whatever they want to do, but I think it should not be dictated by the state. So the whole problem with state egoism is that because the state prescribes the gender roles in the family setting and also in the society context. And this state egoism, according to Wieringa in 1992, it's also resulted from the perpetuation of the notion of kodrat. Now, it's very also interesting because the notion of kodrat derived from an Arabic word. So because it's derived from an Arabic word, which means nature, many people think it is associated with Islam. But if you carefully read Quran, for example, you wouldn't find the notion of kodrat in the Quran. So what I'm trying to say, it's more a cultural construction. But within this notion of kodrat, there is this emphasis that again puts women in a certain position and male in a certain position. And there is this idea that this position cannot be challenged. And it's also very interesting in a research that I've done, for example, I found that the notion of kodrat, even though the meaning is nature, which can easily be understood as a biological differences between men and women. So when we talk about gender as something that's socially constructed, kodrat sort of like trying to argue that there exists a biological differences. But in my research, it was suggested that even though the notion of kodrat talks about the nature, the biological differences between men and women, in reality, it controls more women than men, for example. I remember my own experience, for example, when I studied when I went to UK for my PhD, for example, and in my first year I didn't bring along my children, I didn't bring my husband, and so people were sort of like reminding me, my mother-in-law, they all reminding me that not to forget about my kodrat as a wife. But when my husband, for example, did a PhD in Netherlands few years later, nobody reminded him about the kodrat. So for me, it's kind of very interesting how the notion of kodrat is used more often to regulate women than men. And state egoism is sort of like the combination between a religious interpretation, the cultural construct, which at the end of the day perpetuates the binary between men and women, that see that there exists a fundamental differences between women and men. And we know when we talk about gender discourses, gender is actually something that can be transferable, that can be exchangeable, that can be negotiated between men and women. And in 1998, the New Order government lost its power because of the People's Movement. And then we are Indonesia entering a reformation. So in the reformation time, the government started to adopt the international development agenda, for example, through MDGs, and nowadays now it's become SDG. You could see that, for example, in MDG, there is this strong emphasis on the gender mainstreaming program. So the government, whether they understand or not, whether they like it or not, they have to ensure that gender is mainstream in all aspects of the country's development. Now, the problem with the adoption of international development agenda, as we have mentioned before, that it's derived from the Western context. So very often when it is being translated in the countries like Indonesia, for example, there are people feel detached from the notion because it's not something that coming from their own historical situation, for example. Now, and at the moment, we are. I think it's fair to say that Indonesia is having the post-reformation era, and in this particular era, we see so many visibility. The minority group in terms of sexuality, for example, or the different kind of movement. So you see a very promising rising movement from the feminist movement, but also at the same time, you also see an anti-feminist movement, for example. So there is this chaotic, this conflict between different groups in the society. But at the same time, when things are visible, then the resistance is also becoming higher. And I will talk about this a little bit more. For example, nowadays in Indonesia, there is a resistance towards the third gender people, for example. But I would try to show you later on that actually the concept of third gender is not a foreign concept in Indonesia. It has always been there. But again, because people are detached from the history of the country, people are detached from the culture of the country, so they see this thing as a new concept. Well, in fact, it is not. So I think this is something that perhaps we could explore a little bit more. And also, even though there are resistance, even though there are visibility, but at the same time, in this era, we also see the rebirth of state egoism. I've done my ethnographic research in kindergarten, and even in the kindergarten context, my findings suggest that state egoism is still very much strong. State egoism is still very much pervasive, that there is this ideology, despite of the fact that women are now more participating in the public sphere, but there is this idea that try to domesticate women again. And I think if you are familiar with the debates surrounding the anti-sexual bills, for example, very often those who are resisting to the bill, those who disagree with the bill, are bringing this argument about the domestication of a woman. And now this is an example, for example, that this is a group of men and women in Indonesia, in which they are trying to promote gender equality. They are trying to promote they are trying to endorse the law, the anti-sexual law to be endorsed by the executive, by the Senate, for example. Now I just would like to, because we talk about the gender discourses in Indonesia during the post-colonial time, and I would like to show you a little bit about how actually, because we have to go back again to the two questions that I'm asking in the beginning of my discussion. The first one is gender equality a foreign concept, and the second one is gender discourse something that's imported from the North. And initially, I have tried to explain briefly the history of gender discourses in Indonesia after post-colonial time. And even since the post-colonial time, we can see that there is actually a high level of involvement in the politics, but it is through the ideology promoted by the New Order government that we are losing track of the history. Now, what happened is that if we trace back the history even further to the pre-independence time, we will see also a very interesting and also convincing evidence from the country. For example, it's very interesting to see that, for example, in Indonesia, they held the first Congress, the first woman Congress in 1928. It's actually the Congress was held on the 22nd December 1928, and 1928, yes, correct. But now it's very interesting because that day, 22nd December, is now celebrated as a Mother's Day. So I'm not against the role of a woman as a mother. I myself am a mother, but I think it's very interesting because the celebration is more on the motherhood aspect, the biological aspect of woman. So it sort of like takes away the history. Because what is interesting to know is that in the first Women Congress in Indonesia, it's gathered women from all parts of Indonesia, and it's also representing various movements. Some women are representing Islamic organizations, some women representing the Catholic organization, some women representing the Japanese community, for example. So it's a very, very, different representation of women. And among the agenda they discuss in that Congress, in that conference, is actually they try to halt the practice of polygamy because they've seen that practice as creating injustice toward women. They also try to stop the child marriage, and also they try to ensure that children and women, they can participate more in the education and in the health sector, which I think if you look at the time, 1928, it's a very phenomenal and also very revolutionary movement. I think if I'm not mistaken, in America, for example, only in 1960, if I'm not mistaken, that women are allowed to enter to the college, if I'm not mistaken. Some of you may correct me later on. But I think this kind of movement, this kind of resistance, it actually is not something new. Women in Indonesia, they've been trying to do this even since the pre-independence time. And during the independence time, they were involved in the politics. So if nowadays they are questioned, they try to domesticate women, I think, in my opinion, it is really losing track of the history. It's completely detached from the history of the country because demanding for their rights, ensuring that women can participate in the public space, is something that women in Indonesia have always been doing since the pre-independence time. And I also would like to invite you to see what happened among indigenous people. So this is something that probably you're going to discuss in the next couple of days. I think there will be some presentation that try to unpack gender discourse, I think in Sundanese and also in another indigenous society. But in my presentation, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the gender discourse during the pre-colonial time among indigenous society, for example. Now, I don't know if you are familiar, for example, with this is the people, the what do you call it, the people story, it's like the
Legend.
legend, sorry. Not legend, Pak Ubad. Cerita
Folklore,
rakyat
is it a
itu apa?
folklore?
Folklore.
Yes, a folklore. Yeah, a folklore in Sundanese people, for example, in people in West Java. It's such a shame that we have to conduct the summer school program through online. Otherwise, if you are Indonesia, I'm sure the committee will bring you to this mount of Tangkuban Perahu. It is a very beautiful mount from a distance. It looks like an upside down boat. And there is a story behind this. The story, it's almost like the Sundanese version of an Oedipus story, where a son fell in love with his mother. He doesn't know that it was his mother, for example. And so he proposed his mother. He would like to marry her. And she tried her best to stop the marriage because her son couldn't believe when she informed her that she's her mother, because she looks very young, and beautiful and things like that. So I'm not going into detail with the story, but what is very interesting is that the way this princess, her name is Dayang Sumbi, was constructed in that story. I think she was constructed not as a passive woman, she was constructed as a very strong woman, very determined, and also very clever woman, because she could adopt various strategies in order to halt the marriage. So I think it's very unique, it's very interesting. It presents a non-docile version of a princess, something which is probably missing from because in one of research of mine, I tried to understand the children's construction of femininities in kindergarten setting, and my findings suggest that children learn emphasize femininity when they are playing with these princess discourses, for example, derived from the Disney, for example, where women are situated, princesses are very much situated as a passive, helpless, waiting for the prince to rescue her, for example. And for me, it's kind of interesting because in this particular story, and also another story, in Indonesia, we are also familiar, for example, with Nyi Roro Kidul. Even though there is some spiritual, magical, mystical elements attached to it, but I think the whole idea of non-docile princess is very much interesting, and it's something that is very much adopted by people in the indigenous society, for example. And also, if we look at another gender discourses in another indigenous society, for example, in Sulawesi, for example, they recognize gender not only two categories as male and female, but they have 5 categories, for example. Yeah, so in this particular picture, for example, this is the 5 gender. So what I'm trying to say is that gender is very much fluid in that society. The highest gender expression will be bisu, and bisu, I think it will be closely related to our understanding about trans women, for example. But again, I think this is why people are feeling detached when they hear the term trans woman, because it is something foreign to them. While in fact, in the indigenous society, they already have the term to describe trans woman, and they name it as a bisu. And what is interesting in Sulawesi, for example, even though it's now very limited, but they still recognize the existence of the bisu. And because they've seen bisu as a person who don't belong into the category, the binary category between male and female, then they construct bisu as someone with a certain particular spiritual strength. Yes, of course, you might argue that it is a, a society's attempt, society's strategy in order to desexualize them. But what I'm trying to say is that the local people, the indigenous people, they have their own strategy, they have their own way of negotiating the discussion about sexuality. And very often, what is interesting is that because bisu is constructed as someone that possess spiritual strength, so very often in many religious agenda, for example, when people would like to go for pilgrimage in Makkah, for example, or when people are going to get married, they will invite bisu and ask for their blessing. So they become sort of like a cultural and also spiritual figure that to some extent is seen as having higher status than the other people, the other individual in the society. So for me, it's also showing that, you know, the discussion about the fluidity of gender is not something foreign in the Indonesian context. And I'm sure if we dig into another indigenous practices, into another indigenous culture, you will also find the similar expression, different names, but probably similar expression. So what I'm trying to say again, this is not something foreign actually, but people, because they have been detaching from the cultural context, from the country's cultural context, now they see this as something which is imported from the west, from the north. Well, in fact, it's actually been there. It has been there in the society itself. Yeah, I'm sorry. And I would like to invite you to watch this YouTube. Maybe some of you have watched it. Let's take a look. This is also again illuminating the idea that, you know, the whole discussion about non-binary gender, about gender equality, about the whole gender discourse is not a foreign concept. It's something which has been embedded in the indigenous people. So what I'm trying to argue, I guess, in my presentation is that the whole movement for gender equality, going back again to the first question that opening up my presentation, that the whole movement toward gender equality, the whole movement to recognize the fluidity of gender is not a Western concept, but rather it is an act of decolonization because it's been there in our history. But now I will invite you to look at this YouTube video.
Ibu Vina, I think you need to stop sharing first and then revisit the video because we cannot see the video yet. Bu Vina.
Nama saya Rianto, saya penari dan koreografer. Saya fokus pada kesenian lengger lanang.
Bu Vina.
Jawa Tengah.
Bu Vina.
Saya beranggapan bahwa saya seorang laki-laki saja, itu saya sendiri merasa
I don't think she can hear you.
pada tubuh.
Halo, Bu Vina. Bu Vina.
Lengger lanang itu ya.
Vina.
Yeah, yeah. Hello.
We cannot see the video. You need to.
Oh, I'm
you need
sorry.
to, You need to stop.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay. Let me hold on. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm completely useless with technology. So let me. Okay. Let me try again. Okay. Now can you see it now?
Yes, you can see, but
Yes.
you cannot hear yet.
Okay. Now I haven't turned it on. Okay. I'll play the video. Yeah. Okay.
Sebenarnya
Excellent.
feminim selalu ada dalam setiap tubuh manusia. Nama saya Rianto, saya penari dan koreografer. Saya fokus pada kesenian lengger lanang dari Banyumas, Jawa Tengah. Kalau saya beranggapan bahwa saya seorang laki-laki saja, itu saya sendiri merasa kurang dan tidak adil kepada tubuh saya. Lengger lanang itu ya lengger yang dari Banyumas dan kesenian rakyat Banyumas. Lengger itu sendiri sebenarnya kan memang penarinya laki-laki. Dia menari dengan bergaya seperti perempuan. Dulunya adalah untuk upacara ritual memang, karena pelakunya adalah semuanya laki-laki. Menjadi penari lengger lanang ini bukan untuk ekonomi, tetapi bahwa untuk spiritual tubuh, kembali lagi ke tubuh. Dia menari bukan dalam acara event-event saja, tetapi dia menari untuk kehidupan. Saya merasa saya adalah penari lengger lanang karena ketika saya masih kecil, saya sudah banyak dibully oleh teman-teman. Tubuh kamu megal-megal seperti perempuan. Ada beberapa kalangan masyarakat yang menerima dan mendukung, suka dengan keberadaan lengger lanang, tapi ada juga yang masih tertutup dan melihat bahwa lengger lanang ini adalah kaum banci atau kaum yang minoritas yang sebenarnya tidak harus ada di sini gitu.
Yeah. Okay. Now going back again to my presentation.
Okay.
Now. So I think the video is just illustrating again, as I mentioned, that in the indigenous society, that dance that you just showed just now, it's now in danger, because now not so many people, because they've seen that apart from the issue of gender and sexuality, they also see that as something which is traditional, not modern, and that's why many people, young people, they don't try to learn traditional dance anymore. But what I'm trying to say is that if we see this video again, the discussion that go beyond the binary between men and women has always been existed in the society. And in another documentary, which is a bit longer than that one, actually, it's also very interesting to learn that the dancer, for example, is a married man. He has wife, he has children. So I think it's just an interesting example of how actually our indigenous society, they are so rich with gender discourses, and all we have to do is try to dig into the history, try to dig into the cultural context, and then perhaps we can understand, as I mentioned here, that the whole movement that tries to create gender equality and anything which is related to gender discourse is actually a decolonializing process, not importing a Western concept, for example. So by this, I would like to conclude my presentation that to decolonial gender discourse means to make the experience and struggle of the local people more visible, as I mentioned earlier, to bring the history, to connect again to the history, because we have been so disconnected, we have been so detached from the history. So the decolonialization project means that it's our aim, our attempt to reconnect again with the history. And by doing that, perhaps we can make a new geopolitics of knowledge. So by this, I stop my presentation, and I will be more than happy to have any discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Fina, for such a fruitful presentation. Well, everybody, why don't we do it together? Let's give a big round of virtual applause for Ibu Fina. Yes, that's great. Well, before we come to the Q&A session, the discussion session, I would like to inform you that a link has been shared for your attendance record. So please click it and then fill out all the required fields to record your attendance. And then number two is that nor me as a moderator, neither me as a moderator nor the master of ceremony is going to summarize all the presentation by all the speakers in this program, because it's your job. I mean, your final project is to present this whole issue divided into 3 big issues and then subgroups. So it's your job to sum up all the presentations. So now we've come to the question and answer session. I would like to give the first 3 participants from the floor to ask. You can actually just raise your hand manually, and then I will select some of the participants to directly hit the question to the speaker. Anybody? Yes, Georgia, please. Could you please unmute your audio, Georgia? Yeah.
Terima kasih banyak, Bu Vina. That was really good. I have a question, whether with your research, have you done much, or have you looked much into about Sri Kandi? I know about Sri Kandi from one of my friends. It's a party in universities in Indonesia. Mm-hmm. It's a feminist university group, and throughout Indonesia, and they, yeah. What do you know?
Thank you very much, Georgia. I'm afraid I think when I was I've studied post-colonial theories for a couple of years, so my understanding was actually also, I'm still learning about all the theories and everything, but I think this whole post-colonial movement makes me realize that I myself has been completely detached from my history, for example. So this is actually a kind of defense mechanism to say that my knowledge about Sri Kandi is not much better from yours.
Smooth gesture.
But I think it's always very interesting too, because when we talk about the history of Sri Kandi, for example, on how she's being constructed in the children's literature, and also in the folklore, how to pronounce it, folklore literature, for example, she's always constructed as a very strong woman. But I think one of the problem I have is that again, because initially when I talk about Indonesia earlier, I mentioned how in Indonesia, despite of the fact that we are very multi-ethnicities, we are multi-religions, but I think we need to admit that very often Javanese has always become the dominant values, just like Islam has always become the dominant values. And very often it overlooks another culture, another stories that takes place in another indigenous society. So my point is that while the story of Sri Kandi is indeed very important to be explored again, to present a non-docile version of female in Indonesian context, for example, but I think it is also important to see a kind of similar stories in another culture especially from the eastern part of Indonesia, which I think has been completely overlooked because of the dominant values of Japanese and also the dominant values of Islam, for example. And I hope this whole movement of the colonial movement not only recognizing the history of Indonesia, but very often the marginalized Indonesian, for example, whether it is people, especially people from the non-Java context. I'm not sure if I answer your question, but I think it's just a start. But thank you very much, and your bahasa is great. Thank you.
Jelek, masih jelek. Thank you, Vina.
Thank you so much, Ibu
It
Vina.
wasn't a very good question.
And Georgia, this is out of context, but I wonder, yesterday when you claimed yourself as Bule Baper, I really wonder why. I mean, why is that?
Because I'm baper, like.
Really?
Sejelaskan.
Okay.
Bule
Ibu Vina,
bodoh.
there is a question on the chat box about adat religions. Is there a relationship between that recognition and feminism in Indonesia?
Yeah, I have to say, okay.
Mikhaili Page, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry again, Mikhaili, yeah? Hi, Mikhaili, thank you very much for the question. I hear you, yeah. So I think, I believe there has to be a recognition between adat and also feminism in Indonesia, but what happened is that, again, because earlier I've mentioned how the Western epistemology have been very pervasive to the extent that it influenced all the discipline of knowledge, for example, including when we talk about gender studies, we always refer to the history, to the stories, to the theories articulated from the Western. So, for example, I have to say in Indonesia, this is my own reflexivity as a feminist who are involved in the movement in Indonesia. I have to say that the discourse of feminism in Indonesia is still very much confined to the second wave feminism, when we are mostly talking about the issue of right. And perhaps that's because it's still very much important for us to talk about the equal rights, to talk about gender equality between men and women. But again, because the emphasis is still very much on the individual rights, then we also sometimes tend to overlook the intersection between culture and also gender, for example. So again, I'm mentioning just now, for example, how certain adat in Indonesia are facing discriminated, perhaps not so much related with their gender, but because of their faith, for example. I have a colleague, for example, who are practicing Sunda Wiwitan, and I know she's struggling in order to get her marriage being recognized by the state. So she has to disguise either as a Muslim or a Christian in order to have her rights being recognized by the state. And for me, that's a feminist issue, because if there are certain groups in a society which cannot be fulfilled their rights, then obviously there is the issue of justice. And I think justice has always been very central in the feminist movement. But I think sometimes it overlooks because, again, we are still very much focusing on the individual's right. And also we tend to forget that, I think the whole, I'm sorry if my answer is going here and there, Michaela, but I think what I adopt from the post-colonial theories is that, okay, post-colonial theories is criticizing the dominance of Western theories, but in the Indonesian context, I think we can also use post-colonial theories to understand, again, the dominance of Japanese values, for example, or even I'm Sundanese, so I'm very much aware how as a Sundanese, I gain more privilege than other ethnicities, for example. So I think a lens of post-colonial will also help a feminist movement in Indonesia to unpack their privilege and perhaps working together with another feminist group from the indigenous people in order to create a more justice society. So I hope that answers your question, Michaela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Vina. Well, apparently there is another question on the chat box. You talked about 5 categories of gender discourse in Sundanese, and the first was trans women. I wonder what the rest 4 are.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. Actually, it's not in Sundanese. It's in Sulawesi. So my apologize from making that mistake. Yes. So let me see if I could remember. Yeah. So in Sulawesi, in in Sulawesi Selatan, I'm sorry, I'm losing my English. I think I'm nervous. I think in Sulawesi Selatan, actually there are 5 gender categories among Bugis people. So Bugis is also specific ethnicities, yeah, in Sulawesi Selatan. What I could remember is that they have bisu, for example, yeah. So bisu. Some translate bisu as gender neutral, but I think if you see bisu is actually very much closely translated as trans woman in my understanding. And then there is also chalalai. Chalalai is what in modern term perhaps we could understand them and we could find them as a trans man, for example. And then there is also chalabai. Chalabai is the other way around. So, and there is also a queer person. So a queer person is, I think Bugis is a queer person. Sorry, Bugis is a queer person, and that's it doesn't belong to any categories. So I think if nowadays people are talking about, you know, their gender identity being queer, it's actually not something foreign. It's been there, but again, because people are detaching from the history, when they see about this queer movement, or what is it? Is it something new? Well, in fact, it's not. And then they also have chalabai, which is basically a trans woman, and then chalalai is a trans man, and they have male and female. And I think it's not only in Indonesia. I think if we look at the indigenous people in the America, for example, among Indian people, for example, they also recognize this non-binary gender. So the whole idea about the third gender, fourth gender, fifth gender is actually it's not something new for the indigenous people. Okay. So I hope that answers your question. Feel done, yeah? Thank you.
Okay, questions keep coming. Next, Rosa Smith, yes. you can please
yes,
unmute.
Colin, thank you for correcting. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Colin. Yeah, thank you for the correction, Colin. Yeah. Terima kasih.
Thanks for presentation.
Yeah, Rosa, please.
Very interesting. I have a question. I'm a student of theology studies.
Yes.
And as feminism is a very diverse thing, I think the problem is that many people don't know the real meaning of feminism, and many women call themselves feminists, not even knowing the basic of that. And that stereotype that the woman in like Middle East countries don't have rights and everything, and the different religions and everything. I was born in Central Asia. We have 16 official religions. Like I'm studying now in UNESCO Academy, and my major is theology studies. And I grew up in England. So I was a diverse kid and looking at the different types. What I saw the feminism in Europe and what I saw in Asia is completely different. But I think the problem is of misunderstanding that the people don't know the meaning of that. What do you think about that? That the modern feminism is not original ideology of what was created in 20th century by the French movement and after the Second World War. What do you think about that?
Yes, thank you very much, Rosa, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Yes, for a very, I think all of you have thrown a very excellent question that hopefully can enrich our discussion. I think what is missing, I'm not saying, I think we have to say that there has been this very rising understanding about, you know, what I have just mentioned in my presentation, for example, pertaining post-colonial movement and how it affects feminist movement, is that I think there is an increasing understanding that we need to recognize various experiences of women, that we cannot reduce different experience of women into one single category. So for me, the main message of feminism should be about justice, and also it should be about intersectionality. You need to recognize that people can be oppressed because of several factors, for example. So it's very important to understand the intersection between religion, gender, culture, social class, for example. But at the same time, we are making sure that at the end of the day, what we are striving is justice. And I think that kind of discussion from the feminists in the West and also feminists in the East is what is needed to bring the intersection into the picture, so that people can understand that women can be oppressed in one particular situation, but they can also resist in another situation. And I think by understanding both the the discrimination and also the resistance done by women, I think we can appreciate each other's struggle even better. I think that's it. I think that's my perspective, Rosa.
And the example which you gave regarding the Afghanistan, the same, for example, like Iran was more or less similar now, but in the past, these countries were very like open-minded, let's say, and there was some change of ideology.
Yeah. Yes, agree. I think again when I present the picture of a woman in Afghanistan, for example, I'm not denying that there are women who are being exploited, that that there are issues in the society, that patriarchy is very much strong, just like also in Indonesia. But I think what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't mean that the people themselves do not resist. There are day-to-day resistance given by the people. For example, in Indonesia, let's say. In Aceh, for example, I don't know whether we have participants from Aceh. It's very often it's portrayed that Aceh, because of their desire to have a Sharia law, for example, then again it put women in a very unfavorable situation. But I think it's also important to recognize that women in Aceh themselves, they are resistant to it, that there are movement. Maybe it's a small movement, but the movement is there. So what I'm trying to say is that if we would like to work together, for example, I'm trying to reflect myself as a person from Java, from Sundanese, for example. If I would like to work with feminists from Papua, for example, I think it's important for me to let go the idea that I will become a messiah. For example, I'm there to save them, to become a savior. I don't think that's the case, but my role will be to try to understand their struggle and working together with them and bringing the struggle into the center. But I have to give space, or they already, I need to allow them to reclaim the space so that their voices can be heard. So I think that's the thing that sometimes is missing, because we often see people, women, especially in the South, for example, in the East, as being passive, as being a victim, and they need to be helped, they need to be assisted, while in fact, what we need to do is that allowing their stories, their struggle to be heard, because they know how to resist, actually. That's my point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ibu Fina and also Rosa. Well, Thomas, I think you need to hold your question, because I would like to let Colin to talk first, to speak more about gender fluidity among indigenous people. So Colin first,
Please.
please.
Thank you, Colin.
Hi, thank you, first of all, Ibu Fina, for the awesome presentation. So when you mentioned Bisu among the Bugis people, and that you mentioned, I don't know much about them, but you did mention that somehow they're perceived as possessing spiritual strength. In my mind, it reminded me of the concept of Ray Ray in French Polynesia. So that's where I studied last year in Tahiti. So traditionally in the society, they also have this concept of this magic person who's able to understand both male and female and become this spiritual person. So I think it's really interesting that to find that connection between indigenous communities.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a very good point, Colin. And I understand that there are also people who say that we are romanticizing the culture a little bit, because some could perceive that by situating Bisu, for example, as a person with spiritual being, or in your case, for example, when you are working with the indigenous people in Tahiti, when they are situating the non-binary gender person as a spiritual being, to some extent you could argue that it's actually an attempt to desexualize them. Maybe it's true, but nevertheless, I think it shows how indigenous people, they have their own way to navigate this issue. And I think that's what is interesting. So, and I think for me, it's a very rich cultural practices that probably we could learn from them. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it has been completely detached from our understanding. So as the result, when we see this, this queer movement, LGBT and everything, we see them as a foreign concept. While in fact, in my argument, they are not a foreign concept. They've been there since a long time ago. It's just, we give them different names, and probably it's important to give a local name to it. I think, why not? I put the quotation from the Norwegian feminists earlier in my presentation. And I think that's actually one of her ideas, that perhaps if people are very much resisting to this notion of feminism, to this notion of gender, then probably you need to find a local name for it. And it doesn't matter, as long as, you know, the aim is to achieve justice in the society, to achieve more equality between male and female, and also different gender. I think at the end of the day, it's probably a ongoing project that we have to do. So thank you very much, Colin, for the adding up.
Thank you, Colin, for the additional information, and Bufina also. Hey, Bufina, you still have the energy? Okay, well, next I would like to invite Thomas Kelly to ask your question, please.
Ya, terima kasih banyak Ibu, menarik sekali. I just wanted to ask, do you think that in terms of gender discourse in like modern day academia, do you think it's dominated by Western perspectives? And if you would say it is, what can we do to fix that?
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. And again, excellent bahasa. Thank you.
Tidak lancar.
I know all of you can speak bahasa. I will just be presenting in bahasa, so you don't have to hear my broken English.
Tidak bisa.
Okay, so I think I have to say yes, because I think with this whole movement of the post-coloniality, for example, I think it's becoming more and more possible for us to use theories from the Southern scholar, for example. I'm trying. I was aware when I prepare my presentation, I keep on reminding myself that, you know, Fina, you are writing about decolonialization, making sure you are citing scholars from the South, you know, not all the scholars from the North, because and I think we have several issues. Language definitely plays an important role. As an academic from the South, for example, I'm struggling to get my work published, mainly because of the language. For example, I think I had a discussion, because I'm preparing at the moment a book with a colleague of mine about the gender, sexuality, and culture in the early childhood education context, and we would like to present the perspective from the global South, and we have to reject so many good abstract because of the language. So there are very strong issues about language. I mean, my English is not obviously far from perfect. I'm sorry you have to undergo the pain of hearing my broken English, but you know, when we review all the abstract, it's very, I mean, we have to reflect and sit down among us, me and my colleague, whether it is the right thing to do when we reject an abstract from an academic from the southern countries simply because of their English. But at the same time, we feel that if we accept the abstract, it's going to be a lot of works for us as an editor to work on their English. And because none of us are native speaker, then at the end of the day, it's something that completely impossible to do. So you know what I mean? It's like there is also an issue of power relation in language, but also at the same time, so I think I always remind of the you know, in the Spivak's book, for example. Spivak says sometimes when a subaltern, when you know, marginalized people, they would like to resist to the colonial values, very often they have to use the language of the colonial. Not only it doesn't, yeah, I mean, what we are doing at the moment is that we are trying to bring the colonialization project, but we are still using English, obviously. But also at the same time, sometimes you have to resist to the, you know, to the post-colonial, to the colonial hegemony by also using their theories, but also using their work. And I think, again, when I'm criticizing the Western ideology, it's not to perpetuate the binary between the East and the West. That's not my aim. But I think it's to recognize how one particular values can be so dominant and how it is important to dismantle the dominance. And again, as I mentioned, we can easily adopt that perspective in the Indonesian context, where Javanese is very much hegemonic. And I think we need to carefully dismantle the hegemonic values of Javanese values, for example. So I don't really have an answer to your question, to be honest, but I think it involves a lot of layer of power relation. And I think as what we can do at the moment is trying to unpack those level of power relation one by one. And I think a friend of mine, actually a colleague of mine, in Australia, for example, he's trying to experiment a little bit by allowing the people to write in their own languages and asking an editor to who speak the language to check the work, and also later on it can be translated. But again, sometimes, you know, we are talking about the governance within the academic that still privilege English, for example, still privilege the Western theories and everything. So it's a great question, something that I have to reflect further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Mufina. And Colin just told us on the chat box that you speak great English, Mufina. So
thank you, Colin. You are too
no
kind.
worry.
Thank you.
Another question on the chat box from Nurul Shazwani. Nurul, would you like me to read it, or would you like to speak directly to Ibu Fina?
Yes, please, Nurul.
Oh, read. All right. Okay. Yeah. So I'm actually finding out the quote, "White men saving a brown woman from a brown man," for the first time today. So I can't help but wonder if that was the reason why Eurasians among the Indonesian community now is so common, since it was so promoted back then among the colonizers. Ooh, heavy question. Another heavy question.
All are heavy questions today. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a very one of my favorite quotes actually from Spivak. So Spivak, I think she was criticizing the aggression by the American government at that time, where the American government using the argument of saving the woman in Afghanistan, for example, they are justifying their military action. So then she comes up with that word that the legacy of colonialization can be found or evident when a white man tries to save a brown woman from a brown man. And I think, I'm not quite sure about Eurasian community, but I would say that that kind of perspective is still very much adopted, for example, among international agencies. I'm not saying that international donor agencies, they are not doing a good job. They definitely are doing a good job, but sometimes there is this colonial mindset at the same time. The idea that, again, I mean, if you look at all this, the pamphlet, the website, for example, from international donor agencies, whether it's from UNICEF or whether it's from the other agencies, they're always displaying a picture of a child, of a woman from the countries in the South, for example. It's never the picture of a child in the European countries, for example. I knew, for example, in the UK at the moment that there has been actually a discussion about child poverty. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, a problem that can be found in the South can also be found in the North. But I think there is this idea, you know, the assumption that people in the South, they need to be helped, for example. And again, I think by doing that, I'm not saying that they don't need to be helped, but I think you also need to rather than helping them by giving them aids, for example, but I think it's also very important to give space for the local people so that they can help each other. So I'm not quite sure about the Eurasian community, but I think the kind of a mindset, ideology that believes that there is a need to save people in the South. Yes, exactly, Georgia, thank you very much. A white savior complex. I think it can be easily found in many international donor agencies. So.
Thank you very much. Well, everybody, is there any other questions or comments or yeah, Salma, please. From Oyer Buddies. Dari sahabat Oyer ini, Mufin.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity, Pak Ubed. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Mufina, I would like to ask about feminism. And according to the result of your studies, why most of Indonesian nowadays still think that feminism is a threat, which back in the colonization era, there is one of the greatest feminist figure, which is Ibu Kartini, which bring us to today's era that Indonesian women can get a freedom to get a proper higher education and get a great job too. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Salma. I think it's again, what I'm trying to say in my presentation is that I'm trying to show how we have been very much detached from our history, from our culture, so that when we hear, for example, about feminism, for example, we see that as a Western movement. While in fact, as you suggest just now, and also in my presentation, I'm trying to demonstrate that the movement in order to create equity in the society, that to create equality between men and women are actually is not something new. It's something that has been fighting by women in Indonesia since a long time ago. I'm not romanticizing history. I'm aware that we are still facing many problems at the moment, but I think it's also important to connect to the history in order to understand. And obviously at the same time, I think there is also a global situation, global factors that we have to undergo. For example, in Indonesia, there has been a rising of radical Islam, for example, that perpetuated by Wahhabism, for example. So, this kind of global political landscape is also contributing to it, I think. And I think that will require another presentation, another discussion, I believe. But I think what I can say at the moment is that we have been completely detached from the history, from the cultural. So when we see the feminist movement, we see that as a threat. Many people, many people see that as a threat. But at the same time, I'm also thinking that perhaps it's also the feminists themselves, probably including me, needs to be reflective again. We have to use the language that can be understood by the local people. Like, for example, when we talk about trans women, for example, women in Indonesia are terrifying at the moment. They see that as a threat. But if you remember, you don't have to go back to the pre-independence or pre-colonial times. I think I remember 20 years ago, if you are Indonesian, you must be familiar with the figure of Dorce, for example, and she's a trans woman, for example, and how people are completely fine with her. Like, so she's even idealized by many housewives, for example. So I think there is a changing in the society as well that make us more, probably with the pressure of the global values, people feel like they need to defend their values, because very often, according to Nietzsche, for example, when people are afraid with something new, so they see that as a master mentality, then they will create a slave mentality. In other words, they will create everything which is a contrast. So if they see this feminist as a threat, then they will just create completely the opposite. But my invitation in today's discussion is that I think we need to go back to our history, we need to go back to our cultural, we need to dig into the indigenous practice. Then perhaps we can see that this kind of movement is not a threat at all, it's something that has been here since a long time ago. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. I heard Joseph, right? And
okay,
would
thank
like
you.
to ask a
Terima
question, and
kasih
then after this,
banyak.
Lotte. Yeah.
Sorry. Terima kasih banyak, Ibu Vina. So my question, I recently read that Indonesia now lets indigenous communities put down their traditional religion on their KTP. Could you expand as a foreigner, I don't know much about the effects of this. You said that your friend who has a traditional religion is struggling to get her marriage recognized. And is there any effect on, say, the traditional practices of the Bugis with the Busu, like if they can put if the religion is now recognized by the government, what effects are there for these communities?
Yes, I can't really speak on behalf. I mean, because for the past couple months, I've worked closely with the Sunda Wiwitan, so to some extent, I understand their stories, for example. So I can only perhaps share my experience when I'm working with them. So because I think in a country like Indonesia, for example, religion plays an important factor. And I think that's also what makes feminism in Indonesia and perhaps in Middle East is also unique. For example, like I consider myself as a very strong feminist, but at the same time, as you could see, for example, from my appearance, I'm also a practicing Muslim. And I think in a country like Indonesia, where religion plays a very important factor, you just can't ask the person to choose between two identities. For example, you just need to find a way to negotiate between the two. So religion definitely plays a very important role. In my friend's experience, for example, in Sunda Wiwitan, when their religion are not recognized by the state, it affects to a lot of things. And I have to say it leads to discrimination. For example, because her marriage is not recognized, then her children are also not entitled to get a birth certificate. So later on, when he received a birth certificate, her son, for example, the birth certificate is slightly different. Now you have to understand, in Indonesia, premarital relationship is highly stigmatized, for example. So as a person who do not have a marriage certificate, so her son is not entitled to have a birth certificate, a proper birth certificate. So what she could have is that a letter saying that he was a son of a mother, but the name of the father will not be written in the document, which leads to another discrimination, because when he applies for school, because when he would like to enroll for kindergarten, primary school, or whatsoever, the teacher would stigmatize her, because the teacher would assume that, you know, he's not born in the proper, quote unquote, marital relationship. So now the government is starting to recognize not all religion, because in Indonesia we have so many indigenous religion, but so they started to recognize, for example, kepercayaan in Japanese, for example, and also Sunda Wiwitan is started to get recognized, but still along a lot of struggle, because very often, and it's actually, it shouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem very often when the government, for example, provide a marriage certificate, they work on a template. So my friend, for example, despite of the fact that her religion is now being recognized by the state, still could not get the proper marriage certificate because there is no template for her religion, which is, I know it's ridiculous, but it's just to demonstrate the kind of discrimination faced by her. And I think because as the result of the discrimination, there is an issue of access to education, there is an issue of access to health. In Indonesia, in almost in every paperwork, you need to have a birth certificate and everything. So then it will lead to further and further discrimination. So I'm hoping if religion plays a very important factors in Indonesia, I think slowly you just need to recognize that there exists more than 6 religions in the countries. Because at the moment, yeah, it's very much part of the daily life, and to ask people not to display that as their identity at the moment will also be impossible. So if you want to to include religion as one of the identity for the people, I think the government just need to slowly recognize the existence of indigenous religion, which is enormous, which is a lot. Like I mentioned, we have 50-70 million of indigenous people. So I think it's time to start to recognize their practice, their belief, so that we don't create any discrimination. Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Lotte is going to ask a question. Is it Lotte or Lot? I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name.
It's Lotte.
Lotte, okay, all right.
Yes.
She has 2 questions.
Yeah, so my first question is, I was in a gender class at the University of Amsterdam, and I think our class was like 30 people, and there were just 2 boys joining the class. So my question is, yeah, how can we engage more men and boys in discussion about gender and feminism? Because I think it's, yeah, we should include everyone. It's not just about women. So I'm just curious to hear your view on that. And my second question is about the quite amount of female Indonesian female politicians we see nowadays. Like there are some female ministers. There's the mayor of Surabaya is a lady, the governor of East Java, and I'm curious to hear your view on that. If that's an achievement of the women movement, or like is that a sign of increasing gender equality nowadays, or are they just busy concerned with politics, or are they really doing something for women in public place as well? So
well, Ibu Vina, before you answer the question now that Lotte has mentioned a success story of feminism, I think it will be good, as Colin suggested, for you to reintroduce who Kartini is, because some of the participants may have not been very familiar with her.
Okay, I'm going to address that after question from Lotte.
Okay, sure, thank you.
So I think I'm starting from the the first question is about involving more male into the discussion about feminism, and I completely agree with that. And I think there has been a discussion in Indonesia. There also has been a movement, for example. I'm not sure if you are familiar, but now there is this group called the Laki-Laki Baru in Indonesia, which is basically a new male. So they are promoting gender equality. They are saying no to sexual violence. They are actively promoting different ways to become men. In other words, expanding the discourse of masculinity, that in order to be considered as masculine, you don't have to fall into hegemonic masculinity, which is aggressive, which is violent and everything. So there has been a discussion, and also there has been a movement. And I have to say, it's also very ensuring to learn that among, for example, because again, in Indonesia, religion plays a very important factor. So I'm also pleased to learn that, for example, there has been a call to reinterpret religion in a way that is more in line into justice, into equality, for example. And I think it has been done in Islam, it has been done in Christian, in Hindus, in Buddhism, and also in another religion. So I think I completely agree with you that we need to work together. We need to include more men in order to deal with gender issues in the society, and also to achieve gender equality. Now, pertaining the female leadership in Indonesia, I have to say I have a sort of a mixed-up feeling about this. I think in one sense it shows an achievement. Nevertheless, I think it's something that we have to be proud of, that we have more female participation in politics. But I think sometimes it's also important to reflect and to ask whether that female who become leaders, for example, are they reflecting feminist values? Are they holding up to the feminist values? For example, I remember, for example, if we look at example Margaret Thatcher, for example, she's definitely a very strong female. I have to say, a very powerful leaders, for example. But does she uphold to the feminist values? Well, I'm not quite sure, because many of her policies, for example, are not sensitive toward women. She's definitely not in favor toward poor people. So many of her policies are actually affecting women and children badly. I think, and that's something that we need to be careful as well. I think it's important to have female leadership. I'm definitely 100% to have more females in politics, but at the same time, I think we need to work harder to ensure that those women who are participating in politics are the kind of women who are sharing the passion, the drive toward justice. So by having that kind of woman, then it will not only bring benefits to women, but also it can help us to achieve more justice society. I think that's probably a lot of things. Yeah? Now I'm reading Colin's suggestion here. Colin said that perhaps we have to change the word feminism to cartoonism. I think it's a very interesting and also worth to discuss suggestion, Colin. The only problem I have is that Kartini is very much Javanese centrist. So Kartini she's a female hero in Indonesia. So her birthday is celebrated as a national day, for example, and it's very often because Kartini is a Javanese woman. She married with Bupati apa Pak Ubad? Bupati.
Can we say like mayor?
A mayor, yeah. She married to a mayor in Jepara, and she became, I think, her second wife, if I'm not mistaken, yeah. And she always had a dream to study, to go for higher education, but because she had to marry in such a young age, so obviously she couldn't achieve her dream. So she made a diary, and she wrote letter to her friends in Netherlands at that time, expressing all her ideas for women's equality, for women education and everything, and that becomes a symbol that becomes a symbol for the discussion about women's participation in public, for example. So her birthday, 21st of April, is celebrated as the National Day, and also and that day normally we are discussing about achievement made by women. But the only problem I have, I mean, I'm not denying the struggle of Kartini. Obviously, I think I think it's amazing what she has done, and also the fact that she wrote all her ideas make her thinking is so traceable, so accessible. But I think Kartini is not the only hero in the country. We also have heroes from the eastern part of Indonesia, and they are not heard because, again, the dominance values of Javanese. And I think this is where my problem is. By replacing the term feminism with Kartinism, so we are changing the mode of hegemony, if you know what I mean. So it's from the Western hegemony into the Javanese hegemony, which I don't think that is not what we would like to do, because at the end of the day, it creates another hegemony. So I think I'm not quite entirely sure whether or not we have to change the term feminism, but I think it's just important to connect the practice, the ideology of feminism into the local context. I think that's what more important. I'm not too particular about title, about label, to be honest, but there has been a discussion, for example, that we need to introduce the term which is more accessible for the local people. But for me, what is more important is that making sure the connection between the ideas with the local practices, and that's something that the bridge that perhaps we need to create.
Wow, thank you so much. Well, I saw on the chat box that Jillian Scott wrote one question. Would you like to directly ask it to Ibu Fina?
I might refer you to the written one just because I'm not very good with pronunciation of the dances. Sorry about that.
All right then. So I was just wondering, in your opinion, do you think that dances like Ngeromo Tayub or Ngeriomo Putri uphold gender norms for the old order, or have these portrayals of femininity and masculinity been changed over time?
Yes, thank you. Another excellent question, Julie. Thank you very much. I think, again, I understand that when I talk about this decolonialization of gender discourse, I am aware that I have to be very careful in a way that I don't fall into the trap of romanticizing the culture. Because yes, there is some gender discourse which I think very much promoting gender equality, very much recognizing the fluidity of gender. But I agree with you that there are certain traditions in Indonesia, in the indigenous practice, which uphold the traditional gender discourse that perpetuate the binary between male and female, like in the dances that you mentioned. I think that's also something that we need to recognize. But again, if we take the power into the discussion, for example, I think it's always very interesting to see that one particular discourse can make a woman oppressed in one situation, but in another situation, it can also actually make them very powerful, for example. So I think, and it's important to hear the voice of the people themselves. I think, yes, it's sometimes, as a feminist, when I see that kind of dances, it's sometimes quite problematic for me, because as you suggest, it's perpetuate a traditional gender norm. But I think I also have to ask, how do the dancer feel themselves? Whether they feel empowered when they are dancing the things, what does it mean for them? Is it only the construction of gender, or is there something far more than that? And I think it's understand, again, that's why earlier I mentioned about the intersectionality between gender, beliefs, culture, so that when you take into account those intersectionalities, I think that then we understand whether it is something that we need to resist together, or it is something that again, part of the complexity of the daily life. I think if I'm reflecting of my own experience, for example, as a woman who wear veil, for example, I'm completely aware that, you know, in Aceh, for example, veil become a tools to oppress women, to control women. But in another part in Europe, for example, women, it's becoming very much the way to resist to the homophobia, for example. So you see the same thing has different meaning in a completely different discourse, in a completely different discourse. So what I think what is important is that making sure we understand the voice of the local people, what does it mean for them? And perhaps when we understand their voice, if we would like to interrupt or to make some changes, then we can do it in a respectful way, so that we don't fall into the eyes of colonials, a white savior perspective, as Georgia mentioned just now. So.
Wow. Thank you, John. Well, I feel like I wanted to be one of the participants of this virtual summer program right now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one more question before we close.
May I add something, Mr. Ubat, if it's
sure.
okay?
Sure, Pak Fidi.
Hello, Ibu Fina, how are you? It's been a while. Mudah-mudahan damang. All right, just would like to add that regarding the gender and indigenous people, there's one particular ethnic group. You can ask to the speakers from Sulawesi later on. This is just a case example. In Sulawesi, in Bugis ethnic group, there's a subgroup and call themselves Bisu. And it is the only group who are consider themselves genderless. Not a woman, not a man. So it's totally genderless, but due to the common society misunderstanding, they are often considered as transgender, waria, transsexual, but based on their beliefs, they are not. They are genderless. They are, this particular group believe that there are 5 on sexual orientation or 5 genders. And this Bisu is a holy person who has the whole gender as one unity. So they prefer to be considered as genderless. So this is just an additional information of how this issue is very interesting. And even in Indonesian's ethnic group, they have, yes, they still have something that probably we are not yet covered or understand yet. So I just add an additional information. Sorry for that. So thank you, but thank you, Bufina. That was an awesome presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been talking about Bisu in the beginning, and I think some people they interpret Bisu as genderless, but for me, I personally, I mean, again, I'm using a Western theories in understanding the local, the indigenous practices. I think if we are going to parallelize the term Bisu, I would say probably the closest label would be queer person, because they are non-binary. So it's not to say that they are genderless, I think, but it's more, they are non-binary. They cannot be put into boxes, for example, and that's why they occupy a special position in the society, because of their people think of their tendency to go beyond that binary. But again, I think it's very correct what Pafidi has mentioned just now. It shows how the discussion about gender, sexuality, their fluidity is not a foreign concept. It's not new at all. It's something that has been in our culture. All we have to do is that begin into the culture and the practice of local people. But at the same time, I think we also need to understand that there are some cultural practice that's still very much upholding to the gender tradition. And I think negotiating the lines between the two, it's an ongoing task that probably, it's difficult to do, but it's something that probably we need to do, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure that all of us still have a lot going on in our mind, but unfortunately, I think this is the end of our program for day 2 of our virtual summer program 2020. So let's once again give a big round of applause to Ibu Fina, a virtual applause and a real one.
Thank you for all of you. Thank you for all the questions and everything.
Funny reaction.
Ibu Fina, thank you so much for such a fruitful presentation. Before I give it back to the Master of Ceremony, do you have one concluding remark, Ibu Fina, to deliver to the participants, to today's participants?
No, I think no, I think everything has been covered up. Thank you for some awesome.
Iya.
I will.
Ibu udah last minute, Bu. Mana mau ini?
Bu Cici di mute dulu, Bu Cici. All right, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I will need to have some proper food after the discussion. It is quite a new thing, but
all of us do.
Have a nice program, and thank you very much for the question. And I think hopefully in the next 2 weeks, you will be engaging in the process of decolonizing. I think in this summer school, we are looking at Indonesia as one particular site of decolonization. But I think after this project, you can always go back to your own cultural histories in order to also create, engage in the same process of decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Vina. And now I'm giving it back to the Master of Ceremony, Alfat, please. The floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Pa Ubat and Bu Vina. Wow, what a very insightful topic we have today. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, now we have come to the end of today's session. But worry not, because we still have another interesting topic to talk about tomorrow. And so thank you very much to all of the participants for attending today's session. I'm Alfat Eka as Master of the Ceremony for today, signing off. And I'm hoping to see you again tomorrow. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Everybody have a great day. See you tomorrow.
See you.
Ibu Vina.
Atur nuhun. Ibu Vina. Thank you very much. Great presentation and awesome participants.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Terima kasih, Bu Vina.
All the best for the next 2 weeks. Yeah?
Thank you. Don't forget the attendance, the link. Don't forget.
Alright. Atur nuhun, Paubat rame MC na Paubat.
Sawang sula nuhun sadayana. Mangga aku abdi YouTube-nya. Assalamualaikum.
Siap. Waalaikumsalam.